On October 6, 2013, the following post was left in a thread on 4chan's sports board by an anon we know only as the Archiver. Its contents have become the stuff of apocryphal and obscene legend. 255 threads. I have been with UTV for 255 threads. This is the last one. My parents have discovered my UTV works, and they have insisted I remove everything of the type from my computer and be done with it. They will be monitoring my activities now to ensure I cannot do it anymore. They have given me a day to remove everything, and this is my final message. I am sorry to UTV, and I hope he sees this and understands. I have one more gift to share with him. The gift he's referencing is a 97-page PDF file titled The Filmarillion. It purports to be a product of 4 months of frenzied documentation, recording the Archiver's obsession with the tripcode user UTV. It's eclectic. There's surreal erotica, a cycle of mini-golf courses comprising UTV's posts, meticulous plans for UTV's funeral complete with eulogy, and a list of the file names for every image attachment UTV has ever used, and accounts of the Archiver putting labels on his food to pretend he cohabitates with UTV. One eerie section links to 4 unlisted YouTube videos, amateurish and artifacted, which are implied to have been shot within UTV's apartment. The excess of the Archiver's behavior, directed at a pseudonymous and unassuming poster, is doubtless creepy, but it's impossible, or almost impossible, not to be enthralled by it. How removed does one have to be from the limits of society, how depraved and perverted, to go to these extremes without clear provocation? The Archiver's behavior, were it directed at a celebrity, would be at least rationalizable, though still unacceptable. When aimed at someone more or less random, though, it's propelled into the realm of comedy. The Archiver offers only weak explanations for himself, so all we can do is speculate about his motives. We do know, however, that after the release of the Filmarillion, UTV never posted under his tripcode again. A tripcode enables a user on 4chan to take on a persistent identity between threads. In a place where the norm is total anonymity, this is a powerful tool, intended for short-term situations in which it's necessary for the poster to prove their identity. But there are a number of users who take advantage of this system to imitate the pseudonymous experience of more conventional forums. The generally accepted perspective is that those who do this are attention seekers lowering the quality of threads in the name of their own tenuous egos, though this perspective isn't universal.
Posting with a trip code when it isn't necessary is poor form. You should always try to post anonymously unless your identity is absolutely necessary to the post that you're making.
The Archiver's actions are insane enough that many people, myself included, are skeptical of their authenticity. Here are the 3 most plausible theories. 1. There's an indisputable result of the Filmarillion's publication that can help shed some light on this: UTV's disappearance from the internet. How could he not vanish, learning that the poster known previously for playfully harassing him as he went about his digital activity has fanatically documented his every move, possibly discovering his real name and home address? It's only natural that UTV would abandon his pseudonym and return to the pool of anonymous posters. It could be this result that was the Archiver's true goal: to dispel a prolific tripcode user from a popular general thread. As I've already touched on, the bulk of 4chan posters despise tripcode users, seeking to push them off the site by either insulting them or depriving them of attention. Though maybe a demanding and unwieldy tactic, the Archiver's actions, viewed as an elaborate method of scaring an undesirable and obnoxious element off the site, have proven successful. Even assuming this theory is sound, though, it remains totally insane. The Archiver would have put hours upon hours into constructing this visage of schizophrenia just to get a single user to leave the site. But this out-of-proportion psychic assault still sounds like something that one might expect from 4chan. And to the sober mind, there's plain humor in its absurdity. 2. It is real. Ignoring what I've just said, it's not out of the question, on a website known for its users of dubious mental stability and reclusive tendencies, that somebody really could be this far gone. While theory 1 remains more plausible, it's not prima facie out of the question that the Archiver exists as presented and is truly capable of this behavior. His actions aren't beyond the limitations of more traditional obsessions with celebrities. The strangest elements, besides those that will be pertinent in a moment, are those that have to do with the Archiver's choice of subject. The Archiver remains a few steps beyond what we might understand, but it could be true that the internet has allowed these types to indulge their desires significantly more effectively than was possible before its ubiquity. But theory 2 still remains the least plausible of the 3 theories. 3. The Archiver and UTV are the same person. There's an elegance to this one. UTV's responses to the Archiver, prior to the release of the Filmarillion, feel inappropriate. They're more violent than is necessary, and he posts them daily even without response from the Archiver. Plus, as even a tripcode user should know, showing anger on the internet only emboldens voyeurs and villains. A more reasonable response might have been to ignore the Archiver entirely, were UTV truthfully interested in mollifying him. Then there are those videos, too amateurishly creepy. They feel like low-grade Marble Hornets imitations more than anything a bona fide lunatic would actually post. Once again, one can sense a sort of performative edge to it. The document itself reeks of this also. Despite the archiver's myriad references to storing every single UTV post, of the hundreds of posts tallied in the monthly counts toward the document's end, only a few dozen are ever shown in the document itself. In fact, it seems to me that the archiver never archived UTV's posts, at least to the degree he claims, at all. The archiver's outlandish fantasies and creations further the spectacle. Did he really hand-printed UTV posts to homeless people? Does he leave the house in a custom-made UTV belt adorned with his tripcode user's posts? It's doubtful. It's a reasonable conclusion that UTV faked it all, deciding to cement himself in a niche of internet history as the victim of one of the greatest cyberstalkers to ever live. The idiosyncrasies in this story are unified from this perspective, and both characters are gone by the story's end. Everything is tied up immaculately without room for further developments, and of course its author can disappear without dispute. Theory 3 makes the most sense, but there's not enough information to say for sure. It's ironically difficult to find archives of the relevant threads, and the archiver's postings are pretty sparse prior to his decisive reveal. But with what we have, Theory 3 should be the base assumption. Probably. There is no post history on 4chan, no profiles, no reputation, and for the most part, no names. With the few sites that make up the surface web insisting on extensive user information and accountability, 4chan sticks out as a wonky, atavistic thumb. Even the visual elements of the site feel decades out of date. Large parts of the UI comprise naked hyperlinks and flat text, and the resolution and file name for each image are available without a single keystroke. The only content prioritization is natural selection, by which active and new threads survive while inactive and old threads are pruned over time. There's a beauty to it, reminiscent of what might be called the old internet, which cannot be glimpsed anywhere in the likes of Twitter and Instagram. Basic features require codes to be entered into the otherwise unused email field, and users pride themselves on refusing to spoon-feed newbies. It's a system that, by comparison to today's social media, seeks to exclude and discourage new users rather than help them learn. The so-called secret club dogma leads anons to chastise innocent, polite inquiries in an attempt to thwart the assimilation of the site into a larger cultural sphere. Many older users will claim that this approach has failed and that the modern 4chan has consequently grown childish and sanitized. While the site has always been somewhat childish, I have no idea if they're right on the second count. In certain dimensions, the site still seems to react in all the ways you'd expect. 4chan's distinct culture and reputation is indelibly tied to and the result of its primary deviation from other social media, anonymity. And I think the effects of anonymity are best understood from the perspective of the other side, that being what a lack of anonymity begets. In 2002, Jonathan Gruden wrote for the journal Communications of the ACM, an article entitled Group Dynamics and Ubiquitous Computing. It's stuffed with notable lines, but this one sticks out as specifically prescient. Once a digital representation of an action reaches a network, it could surface anywhere on the planet at any future time. As a result, we do not always know the contexts in which we act. It's a sentiment you've heard before, and its relevant extension here is that the use of a name or pseudonym online allows for the accumulation of information associated with said identity, all of which is subject to the possibility of replication. This information could be anything from a nonsensical shitpost or opinion on currently airing anime to one's phone number and home address. The longer and more frequently an identity is used by an individual, the more information accumulates, and as Gruden says, this information can be employed by anyone at any time for any reason. This alone might not convince you to be wary, likely because you don't see any reason attention should be directed at you. But consider what might happen if a prospective employer or significant other were to find your Sonic Underground porn account or something equally personal. There are many mundane methods by which a pseudonymous identity may be linked with your person, and odds are any sufficiently motivated Twitter psychopath is capable of finding your real identity as long as you've maintained one pseudonym for long enough. This is why one of the primary pieces of advice given to those interested in not getting doxxed is to never repeat usernames across websites. But without a consistent pseudonymous identity, it becomes very difficult to build a reputation, which for some might be something aspirational or necessary. Were PewDiePie to have uploaded each of his videos under a different account, he'd probably be mooching off his wealthy family rather than running one of the most popular channels on YouTube. The threat of doxing means one cannot treat a pseudonymous identity as wholly different from themselves. Any personal confessions or transgressions against the milieu, despite the apparent separation from your flesh self, have a possibility of being linked between identities. This notion, combined with the tendency of pseudonymous identities to eventually feel as real to the individual as their birth name, allows cultural demands to be forced upon the individual even through the proxy of a bodiless name. And unlike many private interactions, those taking place on the surface web fall prey to information accumulation, magnifying this restrictive effect. It's not uncommon to see people who have not grown up with the internet, or those who have had negative experiences with pseudonymous users, argue that pseudonymity is something that should be mitigated or eliminated on the surface web. The pristine and wealthy lack the context necessary to intuit why pseudonymity, despite its partial ineffectiveness, is a boon for users and one of the few tools that does anything to combat the adverse effects of information accumulation. Or it could be that they understand perfectly, and that's exactly why they dislike it. The internet is, in many ways, the consummate surveillance tool. Though even public interactions on the internet are not as permanent as some will claim, the breadth of archival functions on the internet ensure that some stuff is guaranteed to survive for a long time. This includes things like IRC chat logs as well as surface web content such as tweets and YouTube videos. Almost all methods of communication available to the user are susceptible to archival and retrieval, especially within the jurisdiction of a business. These things suggest that a pseudonymous identity, though useful, does not free users from the intense social pressures of everyday life. What everybody needs to varying degrees is ephemerality, transience for their digital identities. It's banal to point out examples of ephemerality like Snapchat, but nonetheless they demonstrate that there is precedent for this sort of thing even in the modern digital interaction landscape. But of course, these supposedly ephemeral methods of communication can be screen-capped or otherwise archived. In this sense, despite also being regularly archived, 4chan is one of the closest surface websites to truly ephemeral communication. Someone like the archiver has their action remembered for a long time, but nonetheless it is only preserved in its effects, words and other evidence. The person responsible is distinct and free to continue with their life unaffected once the deed is done. While the action is not ephemeral, the identity is. This assumes, though, that the host doesn't give the identifying information associated with each post away to law enforcement or other interested parties. Freedom from information accumulation might be the motivating factor for the use of anonymity, but on 4chan it has other unique consequences. Its notoriously venomous user base has been solidified in popular culture as dangerous, misogynist, etc. Accusations that ring true at least in part, but it seems to me that many users don't perceive some of the more outlandish stuff posted as earnest at all. Since there's no like system on 4chan, the only interaction one can get from other users is a reply. This may not seem important, but the lack of passive interaction offered by likes means that users can only get pleasure from inducing active, involved reactions from other users, reactions more easily achieved by shocking or controversial content. Evidently, many users do not distinguish between receiving positive and negative replies, and so by the average user's evaluation, these posts end up the most rewarded in 4chan's ecosystem. The absence of non-involved interaction such as likes, combined with a total lack of physical responsibility for one's postings afforded by anonymity, has created a place that thrives on contrarianism and excess. Bait and opinions that go against the general sentiment are not only safe and uninhibited on 4chan, but they are factually the most rewarded form of content. There seems to be a connection between 4chan's encouragement of the controversial and ridiculous and the actions of someone like the archiver, whom the internet has granted notoriety purely on the basis of his audacity. Assuming that the archiver is fictitious, it appears to me that only a site like 4chan, through its anonymity and other mechanics, could have produced something of his ilk, designed to grab attention without appearances ever entering the equation. It's known that people tend to be more vitriolic on the internet. John Sewler's immensely influential paper, The Online Disinhibition Effect, codifies some of the effects of online communication adroitly. The internet allows people to, in many circumstances, express themselves with fewer social restrictions, a phenomenon he calls disinhibition. Sewler makes a distinction between what he deems benign and toxic disinhibition, but my intuition is that there is only one dimension of disinhibition, and Sewler's toxic and benign disinhibitions are ineluctable and inseparable components of a general disinhibition. A paper out of the University of Haifa provides experimental results suggesting that lack of eye contact can result in more so-called toxic behavior over digital communication. And though this same paper is unable to find a significant effect of anonymity on so-called toxic behavior, the researchers' definition of anonymity is distinct from ours. The participants' identities, regardless of their visibility to their partner in conversation, were definitively known to the researchers, which presents a potential threat to any effects of anonymity, since shitposting in the privacy of one's own home surely provides a more complete sense of invincibility than a recorded lab conversation, which is reviewed by researchers and for, quote, expert flaming evaluators, close quote. The participants' physical identities were known. A lack of true anonymity threatens the results of many similar experiments, though there are ways around this issue. When posts are attached to a transient identity, people seem to feel more comfortable revealing things that they never would under persistent identity. Probably this behavior reflects a sense of freedom in the poster, one which is more difficult to achieve under non-anonymous conditions. The self-pitying, solipsistic circle jerks of boards like R9K fit this concept very well. Anonymity is also more democratic. In a space where no reputations can be established, nobody can present their reputation in place of legitimate thought, and no social hierarchies influence the evaluation of posts. The fish poster and the physics professor interact on the same plane. While it's probably a mistake to liken this to a sort of marketplace of ideas, since the vast majority of posts found on 4chan are completely expendable if not actively harmful to the reader or user, it seems to me to be at least a more just system than pseudonymous social media. It's possible that I'm more pessimistic than most, but it seems to me that the negative behavior that's so ubiquitous on 4chan is the inevitable result of human behavior when certain social restrictions are lessened. I don't mean to say that humans are naturally sexist or cruel or whatever, but I do mean that humans exist on a spectrum in which certain amounts of cruelty and general turpitude are always possible. It seems obvious that there are no naturally good and evil people, but rather that each individual is more morally fickle than they would like to think, and cost to oneself is always a contributing factor in our treatment of others. Social norms, of course, create a more restrictive range of behavior, as is their purpose. In this sense, 4chan might be much closer than we perhaps want to the natural or unobstructed state of human beings. Questions brought about by geriatric politicians and inadvertently conservative Zoomers about whether websites like 4chan should be permitted in light of their content sort of miss the point.
Hillary Clinton says nobody likes me. Let me ask you this. Then how come I'm the most popular guy on 4chan?
The thoughts found on 4chan wouldn't disappear without an avenue through which to express them, and concealing these things helps nobody. The insuperable fact remains that even with intimate knowledge of its detriments, most would probably prefer pseudonymity to anonymity, if for no other reason than persistent identity being a requisite factor for establishing recurring relationships online. One solution to this would be the proliferation of private pseudonyms, given discreetly to those one wishes to contact such that they're not publicly available. Such a system would allow for persistent relationships even while remaining anonymous on the surface web, but truthfully, people desire the less direct interaction of social media despite its problems.
Their name comes from their secret websites. It requires anyone posting on the site to remain anonymous. MySpace users are among their favorite targets, people like David.
And the next thing I know, I had a bunch of naked guys on my profile.
Anonymous hacked his site and plastered it with gay sex pictures.
Your stomach, Pokemon shouldn't be eaten.
Due to both the website's age and the camaraderie natural to anonymous communities, each board on 4chan has developed a strong, distinct culture. Many similarities exist between the boards, but they vary quite a bit more than an outsider might expect. The user base of the X board, intended for the discussion of paranormal phenomena, comprises mainly users with an aesthetic interest in the occult and what appears to be a small subset of unmedicated schizophrenics. As with the rest of the site, it's difficult to tell which users are crazy and which are pretending for attention. As a result, it's anyone's guess what proportion of X's user base really believes in ghosts, conspiracy theories, and other creepypasta fodder. In between threads dedicated to sharing creepy images and videos, a lot of users use the board as a repository for horror short fiction and the discussion of ARGs. X can be funny and occasionally interesting, but the board's content is largely too silly to be creepy by any measure. Despite the high density of worthless threads and purposeless generals, Mew and Lit, the boards for music and literature, can be a fantastic way to find recommendations. These boards usually abhor popular stuff. Users seek out and talk about consuming obscure media not for its merit, but oftentimes, as it seems to me, to appear as connoisseurs of their medium of choice. Affecting the appearance of an informed reader or listener is more important to these users than the art itself, and consequently their worship is sort of hollow and their instincts undeveloped. Despite this, the fact that the board's pretentious culture often leads users to lean toward and seek out unpopular media, which can often be quite good, is more than can be said for most similar spaces on non-anonymous platforms. The Mew canon has had an undeniable influence on the online discussion of music, and regardless of their methods and motivations, both Mew and Lit seem to be encouraging broader consumption of media in some form. TV, meanwhile, seems to not watch movies or television at all beyond the most popular items. Besides Sneed posting and celebrity thirst threads, it's only so often you see something that isn't about indistinguishable Marvel garbage or The Sopranos. Even the film general seems to barely watch movies, coming across somehow as greater posers than Lit and Mew. It's Cannes season as I'm writing this, and while browsing TV over the last few days, I haven't seen a single thread about a film showing at the festival, which is really sort of impressive. The LGBT board, whose existence is already worthy of some note on account of 4chan's liberal usage of a certain word, whose definition has morphed from derogatory to ironic to affectionate and finally to wholly meaningless, primarily discusses transgender men and women, with users evaluating whether others pass and offering a litany of literally incredible sexual stories. What's most notable about LGBT is the frank brutality with which users ridicule one another. Despite most posters belonging to at least one regularly victimized group, they exclusively bully one another rather than offering advice or support, which seems strange considering that many of these users would probably benefit from some kind of kindness or affirmation. The attitude of posters, both toward themselves and others, is flatly negative in most cases, making the board a very depressing read. Why these people would choose to spend their free time in a place in which they'll likely be called a rape hun or autogynophile or expired twink is mysterious. Owing to 4chan's origin as an anime image board, is the cultural heart of the website. A large portion of threads are dedicated to currently airing anime in addition to older shows, supplemented with some unique and often arcane humor. A's influence on the internet is too huge to isolate, but I've heard it referenced by many as the soul of anime on the internet. How true that might be nowadays, I don't know. The video game board V is one of the more repellent boards on the website. A common heuristic is that the more traffic a given board gets, the lower its average post quality will be. As one of the most visited boards on the website, it follows then that most of V's content would be unreadable. This is pretty much the case. At minimum, unlike Lit, I don't doubt that V regularly consumes their media of choice. TG, the board for tabletop games, is alright. Countless stories from users' games have been posted here and reshared across the internet, many of them funny, concise, and generally entertaining. Most of the posters here are less abrasive than those of the other boards. I may be in the minority of people who don't mind this one. B is, of course, the rancid nadir of the internet. This place reeks of sulfur, and most of those who post here do not belong to 4chan culturally. B has long outgrown the site that hosts it, and there is little to be gained from gazing into its depths. R9K is one of the more fascinating boards. Posters complain about their status as virgins and social rejects while posting porn and attempting to construct a cosmogony of heterosexual relationship dynamics that justifies their perceived failures. It seems they're more concerned with indulging their self-pity and buttressing a rather convenient worldview than doing anything to improve themselves. And in fact, their model of heterosexual relationships is designed not to just explain the difficulty they face in finding partners, but to totally eliminate the possibility of such a thing ever happening hence, therefore justifying their inaction. It's clear that these people have no desire to change their situation. The narcissism inherent in their obsessive self-hatred comforts them. As they renounce any chance of achieving the things they claim to want, they sink further into their childhood beds. This place is too depressing to stay for too long. R9K is notable for arguably originating what might be called incel culture. All of these places have contributed something to the internet, though influence can be difficult to confidently track online. Some consistencies between them include an attitude of superiority and ridicule and rampant contrarianism. One that's remained particularly interesting is posters' blanket hostility toward anyone perceived as an outsider. Anyone not in on terminology, etiquette, or commonly held opinions on the site runs the risk of being written off as a Redditor or summer poster. While this hostility is intuitively justifiable, it also has utility in that it helps users preserve the culture of the site by warding off undedicated newcomers who might dilute it. In order for this to work, users must also dissuade one another from explaining or spoon-feeding these things, so newbies have no option but to spend longer reading the site before feeling confident enough to post. But this preservation comes at the cost of discouraging growth. I believe that everyone has a right to disappear. The internet poses definite danger to the individual through information accumulation and other superficially benign sources. It's only natural that people with prescience of these dangers seek methods of avoiding them. For any forward-thinking user, the possibility of disappearance must be left on the table. This means keeping pseudonymous identities detached from the name on your birth certificate, and it means allowing room within one's digital activities to vanish silently, without a goodbye, into the interminable waves of the internet. As digital existence becomes ubiquitous and synonymous with so-called real life, protecting the right to disappear is no longer the basic question of security hygiene it once was. Now it means divorcing oneself from the status quo of accounts under real names, faces in YouTube videos, and uninhibited expression on the internet. What's most troubling for the generations that continue to grow up with the internet is that protecting one's right to disappear must start early, and for most, there's nobody around to preach of its value. Even those more or less in the know might not be capable of the requisite prudence, or they might fold under social pressures discouraging pseudonymous and anonymous communication. But without the right to disappear, every user on the internet is ultimately trackable. It takes about a half-second glance to conclude that 4chan contains more objectionable and distressing content than non-anonymous sites, both because disagreeable individuals have the most to gain from the latitude granted by anonymity, and because truly anonymous communication has a disinhibition effect even on the most affable users. 4chan is not a nice place. What it is, in some ways, is a mirthful respite for the 21st century adolescent, who is faced not only with bleak economic prospects, but a method of living in which every word runs the risk of infinite replication and scrutiny from businesses, employers, and individuals. When the rational way to live life necessitates Machiavellian effort just to avoid being misunderstood, it's pretty much expected that individuals search for some form of repose, a place where words have no consequences at all. 4chan and derivative places offer such respite, or at least something with verisimilitude.
Case there, but anonymity basically allows people to say anything, all the rules gone. You've had to wrestle with issues like child pornography, and I'm just curious whether you sometimes lie awake in the night worrying that you've opened Pandora's box.
It's...
In Suicide, Emil Durkheim writes the following: "It has sometimes been said that because of his psychological constitution, man cannot live without attachment to some object which transcends and survives him, and that the reason for this necessity is a need we must have not to perish entirely. Life is said to be intolerable unless some reason for existing is involved, some purpose justifying life's trials. The individual alone is not a sufficient end for his activity. He is too little." It's an idea that's been run out by everyone from Jesus Christ to Camus. I think it's true. We need something more to keep living. Durkheim also offers that involvement in a group or general identity is the primary method by which people achieve this justification, which he calls integration. In an older America, this could have meant something along the lines of a church community, but when faced with and consumed by a matrix of information so voluminous and indiscreet that it creeps into all aspects of our condition, social integration is not so straightforward a task. The naive expectation would be that such an expansion of general communication would make integration easier, but by now it should be unitarily clear that this isn't how things have worked out. Cultural movements infect and multiply, only to vanish weeks or months after their inception. These ideas are widely consistent and seem to reflect a common understanding among people, and in this sense the consequences of the internet don't seem to be anomic. Even inside these brisk and unifying episodes, these people never seem to get any closer to one another. While it's true that the internet has afforded people a certain amount of freedom, it's not the case that this has taken the form of reduced regulation of behavior. The internet makes you stupid, and it also makes you lonely. The purpose of 4chan's grotesquerie and wallowing is not the obliteration of society or kindness, nor is it purely a gathering point for deracinated perverts and video game adult school shooters. The longer I browse, the clearer it becomes that 4chan acts as a sanctuary for those without or with tenuous connections to the physical and digital worlds. It's a tool for the eradication of the restrictions of identity, where one can sink into the morass of shitposting and pleasurable sadness. Inclined users are suddenly part of a boundless mob, and once inside, they travel with the current. Which is to say, the point here is that 4chan makes people less lonely in a way that other methods of popular online communication can't. The very things that are vindictive and gross on the site are also the very succor that helps these people survive. Why do we use the internet? It's a straightforward question that invites myriad answers, but mostly they reduce to the same sentiment. The internet shortens the distance between people. This is often a good thing, allowing users direct access to an endless flow of interesting ideas, but of course the intimizing effect does not discriminate, and one is just as, if not more likely to expose oneself to people and things they'd rather avoid. This is an unfortunate byproduct of an uninhibited internet. Despite millions of dollars being spent yearly in an unending fervor to optimize the user experience on all major websites, to ensure that the ratio of pleasurable experiences to cruel, painful ones grows ever larger, the effort to sanitize the internet is asymptotic. If users are to have a free, equitable internet, then a certain amount of discomfort is required. 4chan is not the only model for this type of internet, nor is it wholly or even mostly successful. And if it and its relatives aren't the answer, we'll have to look elsewhere. The internet is strange and caustic and enthralling. One only has to gaze slack-jawed into the uncomfortable worlds of strangers like the Archiver to get an almost physical sense of this place's gravity. Incongruous mysteries, weathered or eroded by gaps of information, lay pretty much everywhere, expanding and morphing and being left behind sometimes in just a matter of days. This is what keeps me here, and it keeps millions of others here as well. There's nothing else like it. The Archiver will never be identified. He, like many before, has entered the internet and exited, leaving nothing behind other than that which he deemed essential. There is no path left to follow and a perpetually decreasing number of people who care about what happened on 4chan that day. The Archiver's veracity is something vanishing, a diaphanous object that can be glimpsed at many angles but never wholly seen. I don't know what to make of that. At the risk of sounding more pretentious than I doubtless have already, all I have left is another Durkheim quote. The groups we join in order to prolong our existence by their means are themselves mortal. They too must dissolve, carrying with them all our deposit of ourselves. Those are very few whose memories are closely enough bound to the very history of humanity to be assured of living until its death. What of us is it that survives? A word, a sound, an imperceptible trace, most often anonymous. Therefore nothing comparable to the violence of our efforts are able to justify them to us.